Civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this meeting entitled Oculis Facta, the role of imaging in scientific knowledge. Today's session is the ideal introduction to the scientific area that was edited by Euresis in collaboration with Campus. So this is the ideal introduction to this scientific area because this area will not present all the, in this session, we're not going to present all the elements that are present in that scientific area, but rather we are attempting to provide you with some examples of the topic of that area. And my two guests this evening will contribute to this. Before introducing them to you, I'd like to give you an idea of the meaning of that scientific area. First of all, let me briefly talk about the title of the session, which is basically Oculis Facta. And that basically goes back to Saint Augustine from Hippo, which basically made an analogy with the observation done by the saint of Hippo to emphasize how the experience of faith, that it is the knowledge of the mystery of God, and how much that has to deal with facts that happen and can be observed. In other words, Augustine links the possibility of linking a particular path of knowledge to the experience of facts that are grasped through their observation. In other words, in Oculis. This is particularly important because observing is something that men do and not machines. Even scientific research, like as Don Giussani would say, so scientific research has as a starting point a strange passivity. In other words, you have to look at data, you have to listen to data. And this strange passivity leads us to observation. It becomes tangible through an activity that is apparently passive because it is observation, and that observation then leads to image making, and that is the main topic of the exhibition. It is from here, from allowing ourselves to be surprised by what happens in reality, makes it possible to show that our knowledge progresses. You will probably, while entering the exhibition, you will see that the outside walls of the scientific path show a historical pathway that shows that the development of modern science is inextricably linked to the creation of images, from the most basic ones, so for example, images, for example, of the sky depicted by the Aztecs carved in stone, up until to parchments, to the most sophisticated digital simulation. So there's a fil rouge, there's observation, there's specificity that leads to images which are evidence of our knowledge of the reality. There was a great theologist, Jesuit philosopher, theologian and scientist, they had the shorthand, who said that the history of natural science can be summed up as the development of ever more perfect eyes within a cosmos in which there is always something more to see. So the creation of ever more meaningful images from a scientific point of view is possible precisely thanks to two movements that are linked one to the other. On the one hand, you have scientific and technological progress that makes it possible to refine observation techniques, to grasp surprising and often unexpected details. For example, we've recently had an example of this thanks to the images of the James Webb Telescope last July that got the attention of many media. So scientific progress that makes it possible to have ever and increasingly perfect images. On the other hand, however, we have reality itself that continuously offers new insights. So each discovery is a stimulus to go further, to broaden and deepen the horizon of our knowledge. And the ultimate goal is the creation of an overall image of the cosmos that is increasingly detailed and profound. So the scientific images in the scientific field is evidence of the fact that there has been a meeting between the self that is constantly on the search and God. So what we wanted to show with this session is not so much to go into the details of this epistemological discourse, but rather we try to, in a way, explain some big scientific images that come from different realms, astrophysics, particle physics, the biomedical realm, and so on. And that is because there are many different fields that can enable us to, in a way, grasp the way that they were realized and the importance from the point of view of the progress of knowledge, or they can even help us understand the many different technological ways that we can use to produce significant methods. So this method that is an example aimed at providing examples is the one that we will follow this evening. Our two speakers will give us the opportunity to experience what it means to make scientific images and to stand in front of them in the difficult work of scientific research. So I would like, therefore, to thank Vittorio Cannatà, a radiologist who is the head of a medical physics unit at the Bambino Gesù Pediatric Hospital in Rome, and Stefano Facchini, who is a researcher in astrophysics at the University of Milan. And his career is mainly focused on the search for exoplanets, in other words, the observation of non-solar planetary systems. So we have testimonies from two completely different worlds, and the experiences, the methods, the purposes are very different. And it is precisely the comparison of these two diversities that can help us realize the richness the images bring to the path of knowledge. So we may try and see if there are some commonalities between the two, even if the two guests are working in different fields. So my first question is to Stefano and Vittorio, and it is the following. What's the importance of images in your field of knowledge? What are the most important advances in terms of our understanding of reality and results achieved, and how do they differ in terms of their realization, also with reference to the technologies used? Thank you very much. Thank you, Nicola. First of all, thank you very much for your kind invitation. I would like to try and answer your question by briefly sketching what I normally deal with. I normally try and understand, in my work, I try and understand how planets are formed. I believe this is a very interesting question, because one of the biggest revolutions in the field of astrophysics of the last 25 years is that there have been countless non-solar extraplanetary systems that have been discovered. And this gives insights on the origin of our Earth. If we look at this graph, what you can see here, you see the two axes, X and Y, and you see that any dot in this graph shows a new planet that has been discovered. You see that as the time goes by above, there is one very interesting scientific fact. First of all, the existence of the planets themselves, and also the fact that these planets are very different in terms of mass, in other words, how much they weigh, and that's indicated by the vertical axis, and actually how distant they are from the star. They are. Actually, this is determined by the physical laws that determine the creation of the same planets. So basically, I normally deal with the way in which planets are created and how their extraordinary variety and complexity is inborn in the initial conditions in which they're born, as well as in the physical laws that determine the very first moments of their life, the first instance of their life in terms of millions of years. Astrophysics, unlike other scientific fields, has a specificity. That is to say, the fact that it mainly takes place through the discovery and through the collection of data, and that is done mainly through images, so through the mere observation of the sky. Instead of doing research, let's say, at a department, what we normally do is to directly observe the sky. And there is a very striking example that was mentioned before. This is an image that was projected on July the 12th last. That's one of the very first images obtained by the James Webb Space Telescope that shows how complex the whole system is. Before briefly showing what it shows, a first specificity of astrophysics is that this is our lab data. We observe what the universe is, and from this observation, we try and understand what the universe is telling us. And I'll give you some examples of this. In any of these images that has been obtained through telescopes and increasingly precise eyes, so to say, you can derive a variety of rich data. So, for example, in this image, all the points indicated, you see that there are stars of our galaxy. There is a variety of galaxies outside our galaxies up to 300 million years after the explosion of the Big Bang. So we're talking about ancient galaxies, and this we can see simply by taking a picture. So most of our work consists in analyzing, interpreting, understanding what is contained in images. In reality, this data is not only contained in images, but also in other, there's another sector in the field of spectroscopy. In this case, in spite of looking at an image, we look at the colors of stars or planets. This is a very interesting example. On the left, you see the graph that led to the discovery of the first extrasolar planet, 51 Pegasus b, that led Myron Quails to its being awarded Nobel Prize. And this data has shown that the star has changed its color, and this led them to the identification of a hidden planet. On the right, you see the image of 4 planets. There are 4 dots rotating around the main star, and that shows how planets outside our solar system rotate around a star. And that's actually the image that we're going to talk about this evening. I would like to share with you another preliminary piece of information. I'd like to basically address what we mean by image. What is an image? And a physicist would say, what wavelength do we detect an image? So the visible light, the visible part of light is only but a tiny share of the electromagnetic spectrum, of the extension of all the colors that photons of light shows. So we range from the X rays and gamma rays that contain a lot of energy up to the lowest frequencies. The frequency that I normally work the most is the millimetric frequency. That's the distance, very distant from the visible sea. That's a cold light that the eye does not perceive, but that bodies emanate. I'll show you this picture. This picture shows something very interesting. In the middle, you see a star, and you see that there's a blob. So there is an elliptical shaped shape of millimetric light. This light is basically the thermal emission. It's the heat. So basically it's the light due to the heat of tiny particles of sand that rotate around a newly born star. And the sand is minus 250 degrees centigrade, 20 Kelvin degrees. And yet, because of the fact that it has a temperature, it emits light. So we see the light, and this light enables us to see the temperature of a body, and this is what we see. So the temperature of something that is at minus 250 degrees. So these tiny sand particles are the particles that will eventually form the planets. One of the biggest advances in the field of astrophysics is to develop eyes that are increasingly well suited to see and identify the details. And this is what we've done through the development of a new tool. And in 2015, we saw that same image in 2015. So same image as before, but seen with a more powerful telescope. That more powerful telescope started showing these substructures in a disk that is capable of creating and forming planets. We believe that there is a planet that is about to be born in around any of these rings. And this is something that takes place especially thanks to this telescope in Chile, in the Atacama Desert. So to what extent can we see the level of detail of the universe? To show you the level of detail, I'll show you this picture of the galaxy. You see the Magellanic clouds underneath, because we're talking about the southern hemisphere. And here you see how much we have to zoom in to see the protoplanetary disks. In other words, the regions in which new planets are being formed. These are telescope images, and that gives you an idea of how rich the sky above us is. So we're now continuing to zoom in, and you can see a detail which is about 1 million times, or at least 100,000 times smaller than the angular dimension of our moon and sky. And this is what happens if we continue to zoom in. What you see here is the first image, the first millimetric image of a world that is being born right now. At the center of the ring, there is a star. The ring is made up of sand, and that tiny dot is a planet that is about to be born, or at least there is a disk around that planet that is creating new moons. So another very important element I'd like to highlight is the fact that we sometimes say that an image is sometimes capable of passively conveying, capturing what reality really is. And what does this mean? To answer this question, we need to address the importance of the way we decide to observe. You see these three images. These are basically the same image that I've shown to you right now. If you observe the same system with a different light, that is, say, for example, infrared light, you see that there is a blob in the bottom, which is yet another planet, which was not visible on the left, but it becomes visible on the right. And you can see it in yet another way on the right image. So the interesting part of this is that the ability that man had, that scientists have, to resort to different investigation techniques to look at the same phenomenon enables us to highlight bits of that reality and physical phenomena contained in that data of reality that are diverse and yet complementary. So there is a constant dialogue between a reality, a piece of datum of our reality in which you have everything. You have cold sand, you have gas emissions that basically fall on a planet and gets heated up to 10,000 degrees. And the disclosure of these different types of physical phenomena depends on the way that, on the method we decide to use. And here lies the role of the scientist who decides how to observe a given physical phenomena. And I would like to stop here to then continue afterwards.
Bene, grazie Nicola.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for having me here. So we can say that I am going to talk about an image which is very distant from the technological point of view from the images we've just seen. The exhibition here at the meeting called In Oculis Facta describes very well through some exemplifying images in very different fields, astrophysics and bioimages, how the scientific knowledge can make sudden and important leaps forward, starting from the information that directly or indirectly are contained in it. I'm going to talk to you about an image from among you, the ones you will find in the exhibition, not from the scientific physical point of view, but to highlight, thanks to an exemplifying case, why, at least in my opinion, this image is so important and which leap forward in scientific knowledge it has enabled. This is the image I would like to talk to you about. The first X-ray of the history by the German physicist Röntgen in 1895. It is the left hand of a woman, Bertha Ludwig, his wife. Apparently, seen with today's eyes, soon after what we saw, it may seem nothing exceptional. It's nothing so far away, not so small. It is not something which may not be interpreted so easily. It is a part of the body used most frequently by all of us. A first element which makes this image unique is that Röntgen, for the first time, used a particular type of radiation to manage to see what the human eye had never been able to see up to that moment without the need to open, cut, and stitch with no pain and no bloody surgery. Röntgen provided the scientific community with a powerful tool, very powerful tool, for the diagnosis and treatment of a huge number of diseases. Today, a little bit more than 120 years after this discovery, although flanked by numerous other techniques such as sound, magnetic resonance, imaging, nuclear medicine, just to name a few, the radiation he discovered is used all over the world, at all latitudes, billions of times a year, to produce medical images with an enormous impact on the health of us all. And so what made this discovery possible? How was it possible to obtain this image? And who is Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen? Röntgen was born in Lennep in Germany on the 27th of March, 1845. When he was 18, he was attending the Technical Institute, and an unexpected event occurred that would influence the whole of his life. A student in his class, during a break, drew a caricature of a professor on the blackboard. Röntgen was blamed for the incident, and he refused to reveal the name of the person responsible. He was expelled from the school. To be admitted to the university courses, he still had to take the private exam, but on his first and second attempts the following year, he found in the commission the teacher who was the subject of the caricature on the board. And of course, he did not pass the exam. So he decided to attend lectures at the university as an auditor, and he learned that at the Polytechnic of Zurich, they accepted students without a qualification but subject to an entrance test. He traveled to Zurich, took and passed the entrance test, and at the age of 20, he could enroll at the ETH. It is interesting to say that exactly 30 years later, Albert Einstein also enrolled at the ETH Zurich and passed the entrance exam only on his second attempt. In any case, during the time at university, he met two people in Zurich who would profoundly mark his life, directly or indirectly linked to the image we are talking about this evening. Anna Bertha Ludwig, the one who would become his wife a few years later, and August Kundt, a professor of experimental physics at the Zurich Polytechnic. Kundt recognized Röntgen's abilities early, and the two became close friends. Their friendship would last for many years. Then Kundt traveled to Zurich to hold positions at various universities, and each time asked Röntgen to follow him, which he did. At the age of 43, he was called to head the Physics Institute in Würzburg, Germany, where he took up residence with a family on the upper floor of the laboratory, and this is an important detail for what I will tell you later. When he arrived in Würzburg, he was in the midst of experimental research on a crucial topic for physics at the end of the 19th century. What is the intimate structure of matter? What are atoms made of? For more than 25 years, physicists have been trying to answer this question, mainly by studying the effect of electric current passing through gases enclosed in glass tubes with electrodes placed at both ends, called cathode ray tubes. So you see them in this picture. The electric current in cathode ray tubes flows from the cathode to the anode, and the radiation, rather the rays, were identified precisely as cathode rays, the same rays we use in our television sets until a few years ago, before the LCD TVs were invented. So all physics laboratories at the time were equipped with tubes and equipment to do this type of experiment. Röntgen, too, therefore used cathode ray tubes in his laboratory. And it was during the afternoon of the 8th of November, 1895, that he casually noticed, out of the corner of his eye, that there was a dim light emanating from a screen placed on a couple of meters away from the cathode ray tube in operation at the time. The screen was covered with a fluorescent material, which has a very complicated name, barium platinocyanide. Today we know this is a material that can emit visible light when hit by X-rays. Röntgen wondered what radiation it was that made a fluorescent screen glow even when he moved it further and further away from the tube. It could not have been the well-known cathode rays, because they could not cross such a great distance. Today we know that the radiation observed that afternoon by Röntgen is produced by the impact of cathode rays on the positive electrode of the tube. But many physicists before Röntgen certainly produced the same type of radiation, but no one before him had managed to detect them. It was thanks to the casual presence of the fluorescent screen in the laboratory that Röntgen was able to discover the new type of radiation. The first feature he observed with great astonishment was the great penetration capacity of this radiation. He carried out tests with various objects placed between the tube and the screen while holding them with his hands. During one of those experiments, he saw, for the first time, the bones of his fingers appear clearly visible. In the following weeks, he continued with the experiments in absolute solitude, stopping briefly only for meals, and he even had his bed moved to the laboratory. Why did he behave like that? Because he wanted to carry out all the necessary experimental checks to be sure that the exceptionality of what he was observing was not the result of some laboratory error, but the discovery of a new type of radiation. So you see, after all, he was the director of the Institute of Physics. He held a prestigious position, so he understandably, I think, wanted to be certain of the nature of what he was observing before publishing the results. He was an expert photographer as well, and he was able to rigorously document all his observations. After more than 1.5 months, Röntgen had to give in to his wife's insistence, who had been asking him for weeks about his unusual behavior. Then he made her come down to the laboratory and asked her to place her left hand on a photographic plate. After 15 minutes of exposure to those rays which were still mysterious, he would later call X-rays, the first X-ray was ready. His wife Bertha, disturbed by the image of her hand, commented, "I have seen my death." Why did Röntgen use the letter X? Why did he adopt this symbol as a name for his newly discovered rays? Maybe not everyone knows that the first person to use the letter X as a symbol of the unknown, of an unknown quantity magnitude, was Descartes in his treatise on geometry. Descartes used the most common letters of the French alphabet, A, B, C, to indicate the coefficients of equations, and the last letters of the alphabet, the least used, X, epsilon, X, Y, Z, for the unknown magnitude. However, why did this discovery spread almost instantaneously and universally? Röntgen immediately submitted the historical German language article title that you will find in the exhibition. It was titled "On a New Type of Rays" to the Medical Physics Society in Würzburg. The article was published immediately, but due to printing time constraints, it didn't have any pictures. So Röntgen decided to send his article with the X-ray images to various friends and fellow physicists. One of these was the son of the director of Vienna's most important daily newspaper, Die Presse. And he immediately realized that the historical significance of the discovery, and the next day the article entitled "A Sensational Discovery" was published. And you will also find this paper in the exhibition. The next day, the article was picked up by major European newspapers. In London, this title appeared on The Guardian, a really sensational discovery. That was a title. After one day, the news reached the United States with 2 articles published in Kansas newspapers. Röntgen's fame grew dramatically. A few days later, in the presence of the Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had invited him to demonstrate his discovery, he performed an X-ray on a hand, similar to what he had done with his wife only a few days earlier. In Italy, what happened? In Italy, the news was first published by the newspaper Corriere della Sera of the 12th and 13th January 1896, with an article titled "A Wonderful Discovery in Photography." And you will have a chance to see this newspaper in the exhibition. I will simply read you the beginning, just to understand the atmosphere. These days, a discovery of the most astonishing kind made by Professor Röntgen of the University of Würzburg am Main has been announced. This discovery seems destined to bring about a revolution in science and experience relating to the propagation of light. The X-rays were associated with light, but it was not so wrong. They were talking about the visible, but it will also have a practical application as a great aid to surgery. With such a process, it will be easy to recognize the nature, the importance of fractures, and the wounds of weapons, especially firearms. In the extraction of balls, above all, and all the new method of investigation will spare the wounded man the currently so torturous method of probing, often carried out at random. Röntgen later gave only 3 public lectures on the subject. In the first one, in the lecture hall of the university he studied in, he X-rayed the yen of a colleague in the presence of the entire academic body solemnly assembled. On that occasion, it was proposed by those present that he newly discovered radiation be named after Röntgen, and indeed, the term Röntgen rays is still current today. You can Google it. On the same day, the most important scientific journal of the time, and today it is also the most important, Nature, published the original article by Röntgen in English. In Europe, in Birmingham, the first use of X-rays for clinical purposes took place a couple of weeks after the publication of the discovery. Unfortunately, we have no documentation of this X-ray. In contrast, we have a photographic documentation of the first X-ray taken in the United States. 2 brothers, one was a physicist and the other a doctor, after reading the news in the local newspapers, decided to use X-rays for medical purposes. At the beginning of February, the right opportunity came along. A 14-year-old boy arrived at a hospital with a sore left wrist following a fall after ice skating. After an exposure of 20 minutes, the first clinical X-ray image was acquired. The next day, Dr. Frost, the doctor, submitted the article to the journal Science, ending it with his words, "Yesterday it was possible to verify the method in the case of a broken arm. The image showed the fracture of the ulna incontrovertibly. Any comment on the numerous applications of the new method would be superfluous." So in the picture you see both brothers and the guy aged 14 with a left wrist on the plate, and you see the mother concerned and astonished at the same time. There were several factors that contributed to the spread of the X-ray images, but I think that 2 are particularly significant. The first one is that all physics laboratories at the time were equipped with instrumentation similar to that used by Röntgen, and it was therefore relatively easy to reproduce his results almost everywhere. And secondly, Röntgen, aware of the potential of his discovery, especially in the medical field, decided not to patent his discovery, which is not to be taken for granted considering the enormous economic implications. Both of these elements are at the basis of another aspect which is unique. The discovery of X-rays represents a model of technology transfer, so from the invention to the industrial implementation of the product, that is extremely effective and still difficult to be equaled in terms of speed and dissemination. Suffice it to say that in March in Germany, in a Hamburg hospital, the first X-ray machine was inaugurated in a hospital only 3 months after the discovery. And in March, a new type of X-ray tube was patented, and soon European and American companies began the industrial production of specific equipment. A new medical science was born, diagnostic radiology, which is very important. And at the same year, there was a further effect of the spread of X-rays, which was not so striking at the time, but then of extreme importance in medicine. The use for therapeutic purposes, in that case, on a patient with a malignant nevus. And that was a birth of a further branch of medicine in the same year, radiotherapy. In 1901, Röntgen was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics. He received the prize, thanked but made no speech. Unfortunately, his notes and written material, by his express wish, were destroyed after his death. And finally, just to give you an idea of the scientific impact of the discovery, consider that within the first year of the discovery of X-rays, 1,044 articles on the subject were published, and the following year, the first scientific radiological societies were founded, the Röntgen Society and the X-ray Society. Thank you.
Allora, facciamo un secondo giro.
So let us have a second round of questions. And from a more general level, let's try and go towards a more personal level. So I'd like to ask Vittorio, basically, what has been the role of images in your research pathway, and what kind of questions do they raise in your work? Well, actually, to answer your question, I would like to start from a piece of data that is probably not very much well known. In Italy, we have around 100 million X-ray procedures performed every year. And what's their impact on health? One application, probably the first and most obvious one, is that of the representation of the anatomy and the pathological changes of anatomical structures. For example, in breast cancer screening with X-rays, it is possible to highlight the presence of microcalcifications and diagnose the disease well in advance of the clinical manifestation, so at a very early stage. Or, in the case of a trauma, the presence and degree of a fracture, which is exactly what we saw in the first X-ray performed in the United States. And then there's a second category of procedures which is related to function, that is to say, to the study of the functionality of a particular organ or tissue. And in the case of particular pathologies, to the restoration of full function. These procedures are commonly identified as interventional procedures because the study of the function affected by pathologies may be followed by an intervention by surgical operation that restores normal functioning. To better exemplify the huge impact of these non-invasive interventional procedures, which are possible only thanks to the use of X-rays images, I would like to give you some figures, some numbers concerning the only procedures performed in the field of cardiology in Italy in 2021. So if we consider, for example, the size of the Aula Paolo VI in the Vatican, basically a lot of interventions were carried out. As regards surgical operations for the application of pacemakers, and number of interventions was carried out, which was actually much higher than that of the Rome. If we consider angioplasty, we have to consider actually the size, the number of seats of the Stadium of Rome. And in the number of surgical operations is twice as much. And then finally, if we consider coronography, to study the function of the coronary vessels, the number of exams is 4 times as much as the number of seats contained in the Olympic Stadium in Rome. And then there's a third, last and final class of use of bioimaging with X-rays, which are images used as a tool for healing. Among the many properties of the X-rays discovered by Röntgen, there's one that is not directly related to imaging. X-rays, beyond a well-determined dose of radiation, can cause cell death. That is to say, the inability of the cell to reproduce. This may sound like bad news. In fact, this is an undesirable effect. And as a matter of fact, this is undesirable when we talk about diagnostic images. However, when it comes to cancer cells, this becomes very good news. In the field of the so-called radiotherapy, X-rays are used for two different purposes at the same time. They are the pointer, the viewfinder, so they enable to view the tumor, and at the same time they are the bullet. They enable, so X-rays are focused on the tumor tissue only, sparing the healthy tissue. And this is furthermore one of the main activities that the medical physicist does. All of this has, however, a flip side of the coin, and we have to consider that as well, especially at the beginning, in the first decades after their discovery, and as the use of X-rays to produce images became more widespread. It was quite evident that some doctors, some nurses, and technicians became ill as a result of the unprotected use of X-rays. There is a book by Paul Klein entitled Peace on Nagasaki about the story of conversion to Catholicism of a radiologist doctor, Takashi Nagai, in which this is very well exemplified. So we are in Japan in 1932. And Nagai, I tell you the truth, X-rays are revolutionizing medicine, and they will increasingly do so in the future. But we still can't control these rays very well. Just have a look at this picture. That's Dr. Holzknecht from Vienna. He was my professor in Vienna. He was a pioneer, and he literally gave his life for radiology. Due to the exposure to radiation, he lost the finger of one hand, then he lost another finger, and then eventually his right arm had to be amputated. And here's a copy of his notes on how to better protect yourselves from radiation. For many decades now, things have radically changed. The use of X-rays for medical purposes is very, very safe, but in spite of this, there's a widespread fear, anxiety, and concern. I've been dealing with this topic as a medical physicist for over 20 years, and it happens quite frequently that parents accompanying their children for examination ask for information because they want to be reassured on the fact that there will not be no damages, no harm from the examination or procedure that their children will undergo, and that's understandable. Many years ago, by chance, I was contacted by a mother who assisted her disabled child while she was having an X-ray examination, but who did not know that she was pregnant. When she consulted her gynecologist, she suggested therapeutic abortion, evidently as an extreme measure of preventive medicine. She wanted to know a little bit better, and so she asked for a consultation. It was quite easy for me to respond by showing that the dose of the embryo from the procedure had been essentially zero. And sometime later I got this letter. It so happened that not knowing I was pregnant, I accompanied my first baby to the X-ray room for abdominal X-rays. The information and the reassurances you gave me were fundamental in reducing the anxiety and the discouragement that a mother feels when she realizes that she has endangered the life of the baby she's carrying. The feeling of disorientation in the face of doubts and misleading news that I had been given by others who had even spoken of a therapeutic abortion gave me to a more conscious and aware evaluation of the situation that allowed me to live my pregnancy with more serenity. Even the last faintest apprehensions were dispelled by the birth 9 months ago of a wonderful, healthy, and lively baby girl. I hope that my experience can be an incentive to spread more information about the effects of X-rays on the fetus, and that it can be an encouragement to all those mothers going through similar experiences. From that moment, I realized that it would be important to have a place, some kind of a counter, where those who had doubts about the risks of exposure during pregnancy and children could turn. But unfortunately, you can find anything on the web. And therefore, a section of edited by the Italian Association of Medical Physics, entitled Il Fisico Medico Risponde, so the medical physicist responds, where I coordinate the children and pregnant women section. We receive lots of requests every day, and I just read out another one to see where this information can lead. Hello, I would like to get an opinion on the case of my 5.5 years old. 3 months ago, he suffered a fracture of the tibia, which was treated with a plastic cast. Since then, he has had 2 projected X-rays at every checkup. We were already up to 15. That's a lot. I understand the risk-benefit, but I just can't relax. If the radiation is directed at the bones, how come that they make me wear an apron and my son doesn't? What's the risk? I've read that even low doses can cause damage. Is there a test to make sure that the DNA hasn't been damaged? I would like, even high prices would like to be willing to do it, because I fear that will damage his immune system. So I'm very worried. Thank you very much for your answer. So 13 X-rays might actually seem very high, but the dose is very low. Why is there this distorted perception of the risk? What's its nature? I think there are 2 main reasons for this. First, the effects of radiation, which evoke scenarios like those of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Chernobyl, Fukushima, that have nothing to do with the doses of X-rays used to produce images. The perception of risk is distorted by images and facts that are real, but that are in no way applicable to medical exposure. And then there's a second element, which is the difficulty in recognizing as adequate the so-called principle of justification, which is fundamental for the safe use of radiation in the medical field and beyond, and which is present in our legislation on the subject of medical exposure. So in a nutshell, the principle of justification is the following. Human activity, in this case exposure to radiation, is justified if the expected benefits clearly and demonstrably outweigh all possible risks. The principle of justification is not only applied when it comes to X-ray imaging, but for any human activity. Because all of us, if we are here now in this very moment, that's because, either consciously or not, we have applied this principle. Every year in Italy, an average of 9 people a day die in road accidents. This is at least what we are told by ISTA, the Italian Statistical Institute. This means that statistically, all those who took the car today, all will return home minus 9. And we all took the car to come here to the fair. Did we do well? Yes. The expected benefit of use is enormously greater than the unavoidable residual risks. Car use is a widely justified practice. Some might object that car use is an individual choice. It's not an absolute necessity. One can do without it anyway. That's true. But let's then consider a second example from this image. The 2 people you see are my father and my mother. My mother, folk wisdom would speak in Proverbs, and one of them was that he who eats, fights with death. So she couldn't know it, but she was right. This is a piece of news that was published by ANSA. In Italy, 1 dead a week by suffocation. Actually, you cannot not eat. Eating is by its very nature a justified practice, and the benefits and also the pleasure are infinitely greater than the possible risks. So, is the use of X-rays for diagnostic and curative purposes justified? Do the benefits clearly and demonstrably outweigh the risks? To answer this, we could do here and now what Einstein called the conceptual experiment, which is an experiment that you do not intend to perform practically, but you can only imagine. The results are not measured on the basis of a physical experiment in the lab, but only predicted theoretically, applying the laws of physics. For example, let's do one conceptual experiment here. What would happen here if we zero the gravitational force? If we reset the force of gravity to 0 for 1 minute. If we try to following conceptual experiment, let's turn off the X-rays in Italy for 1 year. Actually, it would be quite easy to demonstrate. It would be quite simple to show that about 500,000 patients with heart diseases in Italy would suddenly find themselves without adequate means of response in terms of diagnosis and treatment. And here we're not considering all the rest of the procedures using X-rays, that is to say tens of millions of procedures every year. The expected benefits in terms of the health of the community are enormous compared to the minimal but possible risks, just like any other human activity. However, the use of X-rays is not always justified, especially at the beginning. We witnessed collective infatuation. Two examples. This is Nebraska. This is one of the pavilions of the World Expo. If you paid 10 cents, you could see the inside of any object and the internal parts of the body. The X-rays were used for entertainment purposes. In the second picture, you see a device, a shoe-fitting X-ray machine that was very widespread in the States. So the X-rays in the feet would enable to check, especially in children, the correct coupling foot to shoe when buying the shoes, and this to the satisfaction of their parents. And this shoe-fitting X-ray machine was used in the States up to 1976. And then finally, I'd like to conclude by making reference to another major advancement possible 70 years after the image of Bertha's hand, thanks to this gentleman, and indirectly also thanks to the Beatles' discovery. Hounsfield was a British engineer who was born in 1919. After the war, he was hired by the EMI, a very famous record, the EMI, a record company in the field of the electronic instrumentation development and sound recording in the recording studio. One of the projects that he was working on was the use of computers for image scanning. Hounsfield made a prototype of equipment that was capable of representing the internal structures of any slice, any section of an anatomical volume using X-rays and a computer to process the data. There was an enormous advance from the representation of a projective anatomical structure to the possibility of seeing the interior along any slice. That's the tomographic representation. So visually, any volume can be represented through its slices. That's the end of the 1960s, and actually the EMI was interested in developing Hounsfield's projects. It had plenty of funds because it was the Beatles record company. So within 2 years, Hounsfield produced the first CT scan capable of acquiring slices in the brain. The first scan was acquired in October 1971 in London, and it takes a full 20 minutes per scan and about 2 hours of post-analysis of the data with the computer. In 1979, Hounsfield was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine together with Alan Cormack. And that was the beginning of a new era. So digital imaging diagnostics, which is now unreplaceable in the world of medicine, in the field of medicine. Thank you.
Provo anch'io a rispondere.
I will try and give an answer to the second question you asked. I would mention 3 points I would like to develop briefly, if possible. The first point is the following. Trying to answer the question on the personal side. Well, personally, how certain images, how I interacted with certain images that have to do with my job. To answer, we can start by this by seeing this short video. If you came to the meeting last year, a couple of years ago, when Rana Genza came, he was awarded a Nobel Prize in 2019 or 2020 for the discovery of a supermassive black hole at the center of our galaxy. This black hole is located where you see the cross, the small cross, and the indirect evidence of the presence of this black hole was given by the movement of these small stars. They move around this X, and we're going to zoom in which the scientific datum is giving us an indirect evidence of the presence of a gravitational field source around which these stars are rotating. What happened afterwards was the publication of these images not many months ago, And this is the first image of the shadow of the black hole that is located at the center of our galaxy. Beyond the extreme difficulty from a scientific and technological point of view to obtain images such as the one you see on the right-hand side of the slide, I think that for many scientists who discovered the black hole or who knew that this black hole existed at the center of our galaxy, having a picture of it had an evocative ability, the ability to give an image to that reality datum, the presence of the black hole at the center of our galaxy. The scientific evidence that cannot be disputed, and it was not possible up to that moment to provide such an evidence. So there is this aspect which is intrinsic in the image. The image has the ability to almost drag you from an affection point of view, to drag the scientist as well as those who are not experts. Image has a greater ability to drag you and to create a sort of fascination vis-a-vis other methods. Probably because it is linked to the sight, to our eyes. It has a unique ability to drag and to raise interest. This is spectacular. The second aspect I would like to emphasize, as I said earlier, is that I think that the image, in a sense, is one of the ways that enables us to touch, to completely touch something which is outside ourselves. And in this sense, I believe it is extremely appeasing. It is appeasing to me, and I think it is also appeasing for many of us, especially in this historical moment. We are constantly concerned about many things, many difficulties. So having the chance to lean and to have a pillar for our knowledge, because in this case we have a picture, we have a photograph from a cognitive point of view and from an affection point of view, is a way to set ourselves free, so to say. So the objectivity of the reality datum does not exclude a scientist from a total involvement with the scientific datum. And this is true to me, and I think that this is one of the reasons why the job of a scientist is so enthralling, because we are called upon to choose the way we observe a physical phenomenon. This is the picture of the same object in three different ways: millimetrical, infrared, and emission line in H-alpha, a very, very hot hydrogen. So you see three different things, and it is the same image. We managed to see three different images because we built instruments, devices, to enable us to see a unique aspect of this physical aspect, the birth of a planet, with these precise wavelengths. There are dozens of years, decades and decades of work behind these three images. At times, you find things you did not expect, but most of the work, such as in the case of the X-rays, but starting from there is an enthralling and exciting work to continue digging, starting from a basis of knowledge that we have in obtaining images, to have an interesting phenomenon, physical phenomenon, which is of interest to us to emerge more and more. And there's a last aspect I think is fundamental, because too many people, a scientific image, such as astrophysics image, means taking a picture, and that's it. You simply take a picture and you have the result. It is not the case, to be honest, because many times the discovery is hidden in a whole gamut of signals that we wish we could eliminate. We are really looking for the needle in the hay. I call this picture morality. It's an image of the same system. It is a reconstruction of the image of the data of the same system in various ways. So as you can see, according to our way of playing with the image, we get slightly different things. We can see slightly different things. The small planet we see on the left-hand side in some images is there. In some other images, it is not there. So what is the scientific truth of this system? How would one choose the picture? What is the best representation of an objective datum? This entails an enormous work on the part of scientists to understand, according to hypotheses, the fact that the reality has an order, trying to understand what is the best representation of reality. Here we have a dangerous game. We were looking for the very small point you see in the upper part of the slide on the left. Somebody in the team said, we see it because if you play with data in a slightly different way, it seems that that point emerges or it disappears. Is it real or not? Are we forcing the data in some way, in our way of interpreting them, because we want to find what we expect? Or are these data really like that? So we spent 12 months while we were all at home due to the COVID restrictions. We carried out tests, test after test, to convince ourselves, as you said while you were talking about the discovery of X-rays, to convince ourselves that irrefutably, unless there are opposite evidence, that that point was real, that it was really contained in the data, and we were not introducing that small point because of a bias that we had on the way reality had to be. And in this, well, I think this is another exciting aspect when it comes to the relationship between the reality datum and the scientist. When one is really looking for the very, very tiny gold nuggets among a sea of stones, and you really put yourself to look for it, there's a morality-related aspect. So having the courage to take a step behind, to take a step backwards in order to have reality speak for what it really is. And this interaction between what is really real and me as a scientist interpreting the reality, choosing the wavelength, me understanding what reality is telling me, I think is the most exciting aspect of scientific research. This complementarity or synergy between the appeasing objectivity of the real datum and the adventure of having to clean, interpret, understand the datum, and ultimately accept it for what it is. In this sense, the image, among the various types of scientific datum that can be produced by research, is a wonderful and exemplifying example. And this is the end of my presentation, of my answer. So just a couple of hints from the presentations by our two friends. The first hint, the first clue is that it is impossible to go out of this room without perceiving that research is an adventure. It is a pathway towards something which may seem unknown, which is mostly unknown, but it has an exciting aspect in it, either for treating patients or to know the mysteries of the cosmos better. So adventure is not a term pronounced by chance. Richard Feynman used to say that scientific knowledge is a great adventure. So there's a confidence, there's a trust in the pathway one covers. And he also added, to greater knowledge, we're accompanied by a more, by a greater mystery, which urges us to go deeper and deeper. And the other aspect is the title of the meeting, a passion for the person. What happens along this pathway is that getting a more and more precise image of the world and reality makes a question more urgent, that of the relationship between me knowing and increasing my knowledge and the reality. So ultimately, the destiny of persons and reality. So a passion for the person, investigating and studying. Before concluding, I would like to remind you once again of the fundraising in favor of the meeting. As we saw in the initial video, the meeting has always been a place of culture. Each of you can contribute to have this great history continue. In the fair, you're going to find some posts, some counters with a red heart, Dona Ora, donate now. You can make donations only at the desks, and you will be welcomed by volunteers wearing a red T-shirt with the writing Dona Ora. Starting from this year, Fondazione Meeting has become a third sector entity, and this will entitle all the donors to make the deductions when filling in the income declaration. So thank you very much, and have a good night.
La civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.